The world once again finds itself on edge as Russia launches another wave of attacks across Ukraine, raising fears that the fragile hope for peace might be slipping further away. In recent days, the scale and intensity of strikes have alarmed not just Ukrainians, but also the wider international community, with many wondering whether any chance of meaningful diplomacy is still alive. When missiles fall on cities, when power grids collapse, and when the cost of survival overshadows the dream of dialogue, the very idea of peace feels like a fading echo. To understand why these latest strikes have generated such global concern, we first need to see the bigger picture. The war in Ukraine has never been about just one piece of land or one city. It is about influence, power, survival, and the shifting dynamics between East and West. Each time Russia intensifies its offensive, it sends a message to both Ukraine and its Western backers. That message is one of defiance, of showing that Moscow is not willing to bow to pressure, sanctions, or peace negotiations that it sees as favoring the West. For many observers, these fresh strikes are not random. They are calculated moves designed to reset the negotiating table, to remind the world that Russia will not be sidelined in shaping the outcome of this war. But diplomacy thrives only when there is trust, or at least the possibility of compromise. With every missile strike, that already slim space for dialogue shrinks further. Leaders in Europe and beyond worry that these escalations are killing off what little hope remains for a negotiated settlement. The West had been quietly exploring avenues for talks, even if only informal back channels. But when civilian areas are hit and infrastructure is shattered, it becomes politically impossible for Western leaders to push openly for dialogue. Their own publics demand a strong response, and Ukrainian officials, facing the human cost of war daily, push harder for military aid instead of peace concessions. At the same time, the Muslim world observes this crisis with a unique perspective. Many Muslim-majority nations have lived through years of conflict, intervention, and failed diplomacy themselves, whether in Palestine, Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan. For them, the sight of global powers unable or unwilling to find a peaceful resolution feels like history repeating itself. The difference here is that Ukraine sits at the heart of Europe, and the response is swift, massive, and relentless in terms of aid and political support. This raises deep questions about double standards. When Gaza suffers airstrikes, when Yemen faces humanitarian collapse, or when Syria is bombarded, calls for peace and outrage often take a muted tone in Western capitals compared to the alarm now being raised for Ukraine. It is this uneven application of diplomacy that many Muslims find troubling, and these concerns must be part of any global conversation about peace and justice. From a military technical perspective, Russia's latest strikes show a pattern. The attacks increasingly target not only frontline positions, but also energy infrastructure, railways, and communication hubs. By striking power plants and fuel depots, Russia aims to weaken Ukraine's logistical backbone. This is classic wartime strategy. Cripple the enemy's ability to supply itself, cut off civilian morale, and pressure leaders into concessions. However, such tactics also create humanitarian disasters, as ordinary families are left without heat, electricity, or safe water. In the middle of winter, this turns into a weapon of suffering. The world cannot ignore the humanitarian dimension, and once again it underscores the urgency of diplomacy. Yet diplomacy seems more distant now than ever. Western powers, particularly the United States and European Union, are under pressure to respond not with softer tones, but with harder edges. Calls for more sanctions, more advanced weapons, and tighter alliances grow louder. But this cycle creates its own dangers. Every increase in Western support provokes harsher Russian retaliation, and each Russian retaliation justifies more Western aid. The spiral feeds itself, while civilians remain trapped in the middle. Diplomacy becomes a victim of escalation, not a driver of resolution. This is why many analysts fear that we are witnessing the death of diplomacy in real time. But is diplomacy truly dead? That depends on how one defines it. Formal negotiations are frozen, but informal conversations still happen. Global players like Turkey, Qatar, and other Muslim-majority nations continue to push for mediation roles. Turkey, for example, was central in brokering the grain export deal that allowed Ukrainian food supplies to reach global markets despite the war. Qatar has quietly offered to facilitate talks in other contexts. These are not small contributions. They show that Muslim nations can play constructive roles as mediators when Western approaches reach a dead end. Such involvement also gives voice to a perspective that is too often sidelined in global diplomacy. The perspective of communities that know firsthand what prolonged war and foreign intervention do to nations. Another layer to this crisis is how it reshapes global alliances. Russia has leaned heavily on its ties with China, Iran, and other non-Western powers. Western states, meanwhile, rally around NATO solidarity. This divide increasingly resembles a new Cold War, not just between Russia and the West, but between blocs of influence. In such a climate, genuine diplomacy becomes harder, as dialogue is seen as weakness. Yet history tells us that even in the darkest moments of the Cold War, negotiations still happened, whether to control nuclear arms or to establish red lines that prevented total catastrophe. The question now is whether leaders today have the courage to step back from the edge and pursue even limited talks that could reduce suffering. For ordinary people, the biggest concern is not abstract geopolitics, but survival. In Ukraine, millions remain displaced, entire towns reduced to rubble, and families torn apart. Refugees continue to stream across borders, seeking shelter in Poland, Germany, and beyond. The cost of rebuilding Ukraine already stretches into hundreds of billions of dollars, even while the war still rages. On the Russian side, ordinary families also feel the cost, with soldiers not returning home and economic hardship deepening under sanctions. And in the wider world, food and energy prices remain volatile, hitting hardest those in poorer regions, many of them Muslim-majority nations that relied on affordable Ukrainian grain or Russian fuel. This interconnected suffering shows why diplomacy matters not just for Ukraine, but for the entire global community. From a layman's view, many ask a simple question. If the world can pour billions into war, why can it not pour the same into peace? Why is it easier to send missiles than mediators? Part of the answer lies in political will, part in mistrust, and part in the very structure of global power. Powerful nations benefit from arms industries, alliances, and the projection of strength. Peace, on the other hand, requires compromise, humility, and admitting that no side can get everything it wants. This is where religious and ethical perspectives, including Islamic principles, offer something profound. Islam emphasizes justice, mercy, and the protection of innocent life. The Quran teaches that saving one life is like saving all of humanity. From this lens, wars of aggression and the deliberate targeting of civilians go against divine law, and true strength lies not in domination, but in upholding justice. This moral reminder is something the modern world desperately needs to hear. As these latest Russian strikes raise alarm worldwide, it is important to also recognize the fatigue of ordinary citizens in both East and West. In Europe, the public feels the strain of high energy bills and constant anxiety about escalation. In Russia, families quietly worry about the cost of endless mobilization. In Muslim countries, people watch closely, comparing the solidarity shown to Ukraine with the silence that often greets their own suffering. This contrast fuels resentment and weakens global trust in Western-led diplomacy. For peace to truly be restored, the West must not only push for negotiations in Ukraine, but also demonstrate consistency in valuing human life everywhere, from Gaza to Kiev. Only then can diplomacy be revived in a way that feels just and credible to the entire world, not just to a select few nations. So the question remains, Are we truly witnessing the death of diplomacy, or is this a painful chapter that precedes a breakthrough? History shows that wars often reach points where both sides feel there is no choice but to talk. For now, Russia appears determined to press forward, Ukraine stands defiant, and the West continues to arm Kyiv. Yet beneath the noise of war, quiet efforts for dialogue still exist. They may be fragile, but they are not entirely gone. It is here that the role of Muslim nations, neutral states, and grassroots movements becomes crucial, reminding the world that every war eventually ends, and it is diplomacy, not destruction, that decides what comes next.